Hi, we're going to start our coursework. And in order to just begin, I would like you first to be sure that you have clicked online and watched the video of Carrie Underwood entitled Something Under the Water. This video encapsulates the mood that we're going to set today as we're listening to these words, but also the concept of something in the water, and this something being a metaphor for something that exists in time and space and yet is outside of time and space. For the time period that we're looking at, the idea of another dimension, the spiritual dimension, the God dimension, is an accepted way of understanding reality. So our New Testament scholars tell us that the word that people used was God dimension, spirit world. And this is very understandable to our Greco-Roman friends, because for them, Zeus and all these other gods and goddesses lived in another dimension and interacted in time and space. So when we understand where we're going today with this concept of both kairos and chronos, we're talking about two kinds of time and space. Chronos being the time and space that we live in, the linear model where we start and continue on into a time where we pass into death. And so we are all under the linear time. It's also called the arrow of time. It starts with birth and ends with death. And at no time do we go in the reverse. So this linear chronos timeline is the timeline in which we exist in time and space. But the kairos is the dimension that interacts with time and space in a way that we are not clear about. We don't have the exact words, but it interacts with time and space in a meaningful way. And kairos is that something in the water, something that I'm experiencing, which I can experience from time and space, but yet I feel is outside of time and space. The Gallup poll says that 95% of Americans believe there's something beyond myself, and that's exactly what we're talking about. A metaphor for a real experience of something outside of time and space. So kairos in the video by Carrie Underwood is an embracing of that this experience is also existentially felt, which means existentially that I experience it, it changes me, that it's part of something that I can perceive, and yet I can describe it with words, but I can't determine its existence, and I also can't fully use words to describe that experience. So let me give you an example. You have a birth certificate, almost all of us do, in which you say, I was born at such and such a day on such and such a time, and that's chronos. You were born February 12th at 1:30 p.m., but that doesn't encapsulate the experience of your birth. So maybe your parents or your caregiver is going to tell a story about when you were born. I was so happy, I held you in my arms. It was such an amazing experience. I felt all these things, and then they'll go on to talk about them, and none of them will ever be on your birth certificate. And they will be outside of time and space. They'll be in your memory, but they're also often this experience of love or something deeper. And this deeper experience is the kairos. It's when a series of events happens that brings meaning in a deeper way, and that has a component to it which actually changes or transforms you. Another way of looking at it is, I'm sure all of you go to a coffee shop, Starbucks, Pete's, the campus coffee shop, something around, and you go there every day. Nothing exciting happens except maybe you get a latte or cappuccino. But then there's going to be maybe one day when you walk and something happens to you that changes you. Maybe you'll look across the room and there'll be somebody that you really think, wow, that's a person I want to get to know. Or someone will say something to you, or some event will happen which actually changes you. And so that particular Starbucks visit or coffee shop visit is going to become meaningful in your life. It's going to be a marker, and it may change the way you see yourself in the world. So chronos is all of those times you went to Starbucks, and kairos is the moment you went to Starbucks in which something amazing happened to you. So when we look at our early Christians, there are New Testament or Old Testament or Hebrew scripture texts, they're talking about kairos moments. So maybe when you go back and say, well, I went to Starbucks on this day, you're not going to remember all the details, but you're going to talk about the event in terms of meaning and experience. I went to Starbucks and I saw this person, and I knew I was going to marry them, or I knew that they were going to change my life. And that knowing, this newness is going to be the part of kairos. So what does kairos mean to our early Testament people? It meant that there was a transformative experience, something that amazed them, what we also call a synchronicity. Everything fell into place. And it means something. So maybe you're sitting at your computer today and you're not going to remember that much about this lecture. Or maybe something I'm going to say is going to open an insight into something that you were struggling with, or some kind of insight that you needed to have happen. And that is a Kairos moment. And when we talk about Kairos within the context of our sacred scriptures, we're talking about somebody also having another level, which is something outside of me changed me. And maybe an experience of that would be you're about to walk out into traffic and something stops you and you realize, whoa, if you had just not walked out there right at that moment, you could have been hit. So there are these moments in which we feel, whoa, like, don't go there, or something says, open that door. And all of these are meaningful, deep experiences. In metaphysics, they're called an ontological experience of something beyond yourself. That means that there's a being out there, time and space, altered from chronos, but it's not outside of all of our experiences. So in order to do that, let me point you to some scholars who say it in a much more understandable but scholarly way. The first thinker who describes this Kairos experience that we're going to look at is in front of you right now on the screen, Rudolf Otto, who named this Kairos experience the numinous. He also called it mysterium tremendum and fascinas, which is something that fascinates and is tremendous, a tremendous mystery in the universe that creates awe and fear, not in the kind of I'm afraid of the dark, but fear in the sense of, wow, this is something powerful and unknown that could affect me, and so I need to be cautious and aware. This mysterium and this other dimension, this God dimension, is called the holy other, meaning it's something other than myself, but it's not something completely detached from myself. For Otto, it's a sense of majesty. It's a sense that I, in relation to it, are lower in the sense of lower consciousness, and it has a higher consciousness. And I, as a person, have a creature feeling that somehow this presence is greater and more encompassing than me, and is full of sometimes what we call unconditional love or presence, and somehow I'm dependent on it, that I'm connected to it. In Hinduism, it's the soul strain, it's the little wind that guides us into our paths. It's a connecting point. It is something that draws us towards it, but not in a sense of controlling. It's not controlling. It's enabling, loving, empowering. The second thinker that we're going to look at who describes this Kairos is William James, who wrote The Varieties of Religious Experience. Now, this text and his thinking was done in the early 1900s. During the time in which Sigmund Freud and others were saying that religion was a childlike creation, a wish fulfillment fantasy, something that prevented us from being scared of death and reality. But what William James did in his Varieties of Religious Experience was to say, let me listen to all of the people who have this experience of Kairos or otherness, and let me see what characteristics define this experience for them. And he listed several experiences that people had, and the characteristics of these experiences, which he felt was not wish fulfillment or fantasy, but rather was a viable experience of otherness, of the other dimension. And his first characteristic is when we experience this Kairos, this something in the water, we understand that the visible world, the world that we see, is a part of a more spiritual world. That's something in the water. Water is an image for us. It's behind me because it's kind of a universal symbol. And there is that world, but there's another world beyond. And our world that we live in now draws its purpose and meaning from that more spiritual world. The second characteristic of these experiences that William James discusses is that the union or harmonious relationship with that higher universe is our true end. So let's take apart those words from 1900. That this other dimension is a higher universe, meaning not physically higher, but more complex. And while we could use the words suprapersonal or transcendent, any of those words that tell us that it's not beyond our consciousness in the sense that it has similar characteristics, but it is beyond in the sense that it's more comprehensive. And that what he's saying is that when people have this Kairos experience, or this experience of otherness, we understand that we're supposed to be unified there, and that this relationship is harmonious, and that's where we're going. And this is really important to understand, because what drives part of the early Christian experience is the appearances of the resurrection appearances of Jesus, in which he's saying, you know, I'm in another dimension. And in this dimension, there is this harmony. And when I pass through death, I will be in a harmonious relationship with this other dimension. The third characteristic is, and this is important to understand, so let's listen to and read his words, but then let's think about what he means in our terms. So let me read it to you. That prayer or inner communion with the Spirit, be that Spirit God or law, is a process wherein work, that is inner work, is really done. And spiritual energy flows in and produces effects, psychological or material, within our phenomenal world. Now that's a lot of words, but let's unpack them. That prayer, and for many people it can be meditation, it can be talking, or just a sense of enlightenment, or a sense of hearing that inner voice. It's a process. And what does process mean? It means that it has a linear mode to it, that something transformative, as Carrie Underwood is discussing, happens. I was changed. I realized something. That there's an inner, maybe even psychological process, wherein inner work is really done. Work. Now, what kind of work is that? It's the work of change. What does self-transformation mean? It means that I saw something deeper. I was able to manage my emotions. I was able to fulfill a purpose that I had, that something inner is happening, and it has impact on the outside world. And then this other idea of spiritual energy flows in and produces effects. Now, what does that mean, spiritual energy? It means that there's actually an effect, and the effect is something that's perceivable, palatable, and remains a experiential, dimensional, existential, all those words that say something happened to me, and it was amazing. And they may actually be material effects, and that's difficult often for us in our world to understand. Modern physicists will tell us that we actually exist in 14 dimensions, more or less, depending on the theory, and that, for example, if you and I were to travel through a black hole, that part of us would disintegrate and be ashes, but the other part of us would continue on and continue on to live. And there are even some experiments in which objects are actually observed in 2 dimensions. So there is this sense that we are participating in this other dimension through this psychological and material effects. The next characteristic that William James discusses is the psychological characteristic of a new zest. Now, what does zest mean? We don't use zest anymore, but it means an excitement, a sense of wonder, a sense of participation, a sense of appreciation, and an appeal to heroism, which means that somehow our higher self, now we want to be better human beings, we want to go to a higher self. And what does higher self means? It might mean, instead of seeking revenge, I seek to understand. Or instead of, hitting you back when you sock me, I might hold back and ask you what's wrong. Or instead of road rage, I might try to calm myself down. So there is a sense that I can be heroic by appealing to my higher self. And then the last characteristic that he discusses is let's use his words, a preponderance of loving affection, safety, security, meaning, and purpose. Now, what does that mean? It means, in our terms, compassion, that I have that sense of brotherly or sisterly love, and that I actually feel safe and secure in the world, that, I can go into my higher self. This trauma, this what might be experienced as evil, is not the end, and I can sort through it. And also a sense of inner security. But an experience maybe that we might say is existentially fully developed as meaning and purpose. So, like I said in the beginning of the lecture, that I went into Starbucks and I saw someone that I thought was going to be important to me. And so somehow, how did I know that? I once heard a story of someone who was being given a ticket by a policeman, and she looked at him as he was giving her the ticket, and she said to herself, well, I'm going to marry him. And she did. So what in that moment led her to just perceive that level of relationship, which would be highly unusual for a policeman? That would not be the regular feeling you'd have about getting a ticket on the freeway. And so what is important to understand, that this Kairos moment is not magic, not deja vu, nothing else but an insight, an experience, a metaphysical happening in which something that creates a psychological, spiritual effect in your life is taking place. So when we go to our early Christians, what they are talking about is kairos. And they immerse themselves in Christianity because it gives them this sense of purpose and meaning, which they have been searching for. And you may have had that same experience, and that may have brought you into religious life, or you may disbelieve that experience, or you may agree with Freud. But our early Christians are not in those spaces. They are in the space that this is real, this changed me. And when we read our text, we're going to be talking about what is also the dimension to this, which is the moral dimension. Creating a moral reality in which one acts and changes from a higher perspective, a deeper perspective, a more compassionate perspective, a sense of meaning and purpose, a sense of being guided by something beyond oneself. So let's just now look at what Chronos is in comparison. So you've got on your screen some elements of Chronos that we're going to explore. The idea that I discussed of linear time, that history, time and place, has a purpose. And in the context of our religious perspective, history isn't just linear, it has a purpose, a cosmic purpose, a purpose in the cosmos, that we're not just a lonely planet here, but that this earth has a cosmological, spiritual, deep meaning. That human development is part of our purpose, and that each of us has a purpose that we need to develop within ourselves. And then lastly, towards the end of the class, we're going to look at stage theory, which is to say that there are different levels of development that happen in Chronos. And what's wonderful about these concepts is that all religions can identify with them. They may not call them Kairos, they may not call them Chronos, and they have different terms, but they have a sense of how what is otherness or the divine interacts with them. And I think this gives validation to the experiences that we're going to be discussing for the next section of the semester as we go into what motivated these early Christians. How is a religion so powerful that 2/3 of the Roman Empire becomes Christian? And how is it that it's so fundamental that it continues on for these many thousands of years in which Christianity has become relevant? And how, even more importantly, in those moments in which Christianity distances itself through violence, through all kinds of politics, economic traumas, all kinds of historical instances in which one's higher self or the higher self of history is not exhibited, how it travels through these time periods to become something that looks more like the early Christian notion of compassion and love. And then finally, this last concept that we're going to be looking at is agape. That agape is this sense that William James and Rudolf Otto are talking about, this experience of love that is transpersonal, that is kairos. And we'll be looking at that when we continue with this class. So what I'd like you to do now is to go to the website and on Titanium and locate the readings. And you'll be reading some writings from William James, some Rudolf Otto, from Paul Tillich, who uses this concept of kairos, and try to understand how you understand this concept of kairos and chronos, and see if you could identify in your life or from others times when they explained something like this happening to them. And then I want to end with bringing up to you the idea that we're going to pursue in the third week of the class, which is the idea of agape. Those words that William James and Paul Tillich use, is this effect on you, is an effect of love. And a love, that brotherly, sisterly love, compassionate love, enlightenment, any of those terms in which there is an actual existential experience. And that agape is going to be what forms the culture and the belief system of the early Christian, and from which the gospel texts that end up becoming the canon, that it becomes the criteria by which they are selected. So when we get to some of the readings that we're going to be looking at throughout the next few weeks, the question is going to be, does this represent this experience of agape that we're having? And how do we live with this experience? And this fundamental sense that agape then replaces the belief system of the Greco-Roman world, and how profound that term is now, what it embraces in history, and the fact that we still use that term to explain the new surge of Christianity that's become prevalent in the small church movement, in the non-denominational movement. You say agape to contemporary Christians, and they get what you mean. But that word took its root in these experiences that we're going to be talking about in the first 300 years. So I want to end by just pointing you towards the water and its presence always in this fundamental ritual of Christianity, going into the water and being cleansed and reborn. And its symbol is a symbol that throughout all religions represents this otherness, this experience of the divine, its transformational cleansing, rebirth, change of oneself towards a higher self.